Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Humanities Cafe. I'm glad you could join us. We are in for a great conversation today. I think everybody can agree that every day we're inundated with headlines and posts in our news feeds that are increasingly more negative and polarizing. America is more divided than ever. That's no secret. But why does it seem like society, particularly American society, has become mean? There's decreased empathy, decreased civility, solidarity, basic human decency, and an increase in division, apathy, and downright cruelty. But why? And how do we turn this ship around? I'm truly honored to welcome today's guest, Dr. Richard Kyte, to explain to us what's happening to American society, what exactly a third place is, and what we all can and should do to restore a more civilized society to this nation that we all call home. So, Dr. Kyte, please tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and what interested you in tackling this topic head on.
Well, thank you so much, Stacy, for inviting me to be on this program. My background, I'm a philosopher. My background early on was in virtue ethics, looking at how moral character is developed. And I've been teaching ethics now for about 30 years at several different universities. For the last 25 years now, I've been at Viterbo University in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I also teach in a master's program in servant leadership, where we're looking at the responsibility of leaders in all kinds of organizations to serve their employees, the people who report to them, to help them improve their lives, to make their organizations better, and also the communities. And what got me interested in this topic of third places is in teaching ethics, I came to realize that we often try to tackle these problems head on. Like, how do we make people think more critically? How do we encourage more civility, for example? And what I learned is that in organizations and communities where you have very high levels of trust, you tend to have fewer ethical problems because people communicate better and they talk through problems as soon as they arise or before they become become a crisis. Whereas in places with low trust, whether it's organizations or communities, people talk about each other instead of with each other. Mm-hmm. And they tend to let problems fester and develop, and they turn into big crises. And as a result, they have a lot more scandals and a lot more corruption. And so I realize if we're really going to address the issue of ethics in our society, we need to talk about how do we build better culture.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I have to tell everybody, I contacted Dr. Kyte last December, actually, to schedule this discussion for April of this year, and we unfortunately had to reschedule. And I had read his book, Finding Your Third Place, Building Happier Communities, and Making Great Friends Along the Way, a year ago, and was completely intrigued by it. So I reread the book a few months ago in hopes of rescheduling this conversation, and I found the information and insights in it even more relevant than it was a year ago. So while I can say I've been looking forward to this discussion for almost a year, I think it's an even more timely discussion for America's current socio-political climate, and perhaps the need to reschedule was a bit serendipitous. So let's unpack the statistics first. Increasing sadness, increasing meanness. What do the statistics tell us?
The statistics tell us that that friendship is really declining. And when friendship, that is the number of close friends that people have, it used to be, like in 1990, 33% of the population reported that they had 10 or more close friends. In the latest study, 2024, that was only 12%. And so we've had a considerable drop within the last couple of decades of people reporting that they have close friends, many more people reporting that they have no close friends at all. That's almost always a sign that people are just talking to fewer people, because it takes about 200 hours of spending time with somebody to consider them to be a close friend. So if people in communities just aren't interacting as much, then they aren't spending enough time to develop those close friendships with a larger number of people. And then we find friendship connected with all kinds of things like mental well-being and health and happiness, all of these things. And so what we're finding is a society that's just becoming more socially isolated, more estranged from one another, and then less happy, less functional.
And is there a role that, like, several episodes of Humanities Cafe ago, we had a discussion about the decreased trust in institutions and other people. And so, if we're looking at an increase in despair and loneliness, and an increase and a decrease in trust in other institutions and other people, that's kind of a perfect storm for misery, right?
Yeah, it is. It's a perfect storm for misery. We're less happy. It's also a perfect storm for corruption.
Mm,
Because when there's less trust, there's less sharing of problems, and there's less willingness to try to figure out how do we make the best even of difficult situations. So you get people like holding information to themselves or working behind people's back, and all that sort of thing happens. And we tend to, everybody has seen the data that comes like from Gallup or from the Pew Center about declining trust in institutions. And we've seen that since the 1970s when we first started measuring that. But what's less attended to is that we find the same drop off in just general social trust. Like people just don't trust other people as well. And it's largely because they don't know their neighbors as well. We're spending much
right.
less time talking to our next door neighbors, for example. What happens when you don't make as many friends, you don't have as much communication with strangers, it's really easy to start suspecting that others are going to be people who disagree with you or who are potential threats. Whereas if you interact with strangers quite a bit, your perception shifts, so you tend even subconsciously to think that strangers are potential friends.
And is that where, like, what, and in the title of the program, it's the meaning, and I mean it as we've become meaner. So is that, we in our social feeds, we see conspiracy and polarization and mass shootings, safe spaces, trauma, all those keywords. Is that linked to the fact that we just don't trust each other, we don't talk to each other anymore, so we're all kind of negative?
Yeah, when people are mean, when we're talking about whether it's a bully or just somebody who's kind of rude, or like, it's almost always they're feeling defensive. There's always some fear behind that. And so fear, suspicion, distrust, this will always lead to less civility, and less kindness in our social interactions. So there's two things we need to do. Like one is I think we should certainly be promoting things like kindness and consideration as virtues and as public virtues. But we also just have to spend more time talking to one another, because the more we know one another and understand one another's background, the more we give people the benefit of the doubt.
In a recent article I read in a publication was referred to our current time as the antisocial century. And I thought, that kind of hits it right on the head. And this has gone on since before the pandemic. Obviously the pandemic had an impact, but we've kind of gotten this way. But this started before the pandemic. And when I was reading that article, there's a lot of there's quite a few factors that sociologists and researchers point to for why this is happening. A lot of what you've already touched on, but how do demographical factors like othering and an increase in diversity, how is that impacting this situation? Because the economy obviously is the big things, but there's little things too. So how does an increase in diversity and a decreased involvement in community organizations, how does that kind of stuff all kind of roll into this ball of where we're at now?
Well, if we look at the people who are studying social capital, which is really a measure of generalized trust within a society, we find that they really focus on two things: bonding capital and bridging capital. Bonding capital are these relatively thick ties that develop among close friends and family, that sort of thing, people that you have a lot in common with and that you have shared interest with. And then there's bridging capital, and bridging capital is the kind of weak ties that you develop within communities or societies where you're willing to trust and collaborate with people from very different backgrounds, have different interests. You might not have anything personally in common with them, but you have some project you want to do, or you want to, like, we need to get something built in our community. Who do we work with in order to make that happen? If you have good bridging capital, that means you're willing to like work across differences. When you have more diversity, what you do is you have less of the bonding capital immediately happening within communities because people have different backgrounds, different interests. They're not as likely initially to find the things in common that help them to form friendship. So you put more stress on the need for bridging capital. But here's the problem. Bridging capital and bonding capital are really highly correlated. In communities where you don't have really good bonding capital, where people don't have good, close friendship networks, it is really hard to develop strong bridging capital because people without those strong personal connections, those strong friendship ties, are more likely to be distrustful of strangers. And you need trust of strangers to have the bridging capital. So diversity is a really great thing. It is wonderful for communities, but it puts a lot of pressure on them at the same time because you need more bridging capital at the same time that you're less likely to have the strong foundation of the friendships, right? And so this is a challenge of multicultural democracies like ours. And we're really the first one in the world to try to do this experiment where we have people from very different cultures, races, and ethnic backgrounds all kind of forming together and then making up these communities. How do we develop the kind of trust that's needed for strong bridging capital where we work together? And we can kind of sense it fraying, kind of coming apart. And this is, I think, the great challenge of this century is going to be, how do we make this work?
Well, and along with the increase in diversity, there's seems to be an increased divide in economic security and inequality. There's always, of course, always going to be some, there's going to be a range of wealth, right? But it seems like there's a bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots, and that kind of makes it even bigger divide to bridge.
Yeah, and when we look at studies of where we have really strong social capital, it comes largely from people who occupy the middle of that economic strata. Mm-hmm. So when you have a really strong middle class, because the very wealthy tend to have so much freedom, so much convenience that they can move about where they want, and they aren't as dependent on building strong ties within their local community. The people that have no resources don't have the leisure time and the resources in order to do volunteering and to join groups and to do the sorts of things that build all those social ties. And so the social ties that make communities strong comes largely from the people that occupy the middle class or that middle part of the economic strata. And so the more you get a divide between the haves and the have-nots, the weaker your social trust becomes. And you can see this when you look at something like the Gini coefficient, which is kind of a measure of the extent to which you have wealth distributed well throughout a society. You can find that you have pretty good social trust in those places where you have a strong middle class, where you have wealth kind of distributed throughout. But when you just have haves and have-nots, it's a real challenge, and especially for democracies.
So we can talk about this next, but what's the influence of the media, technology, and social media? And we could go on forever about this, but in a nutshell, how much of a force is that in where we're at right now?
So media, social media, and technology, I'm gonna because we need to put it in a nutshell, I'm going to narrow it down to just digital technology, which represents social media, and also like the convenience of having entertainment in our pocket, basically, that we can take wherever we want to go. So means of communication, news, and entertainment. What happens is the more we have both that kind of power and that kind of convenience, the less dependent we are on other people, both for our well-being and for just and staying informed and for being happy, like the kinds of things that we look for in our leisure time to occupy ourselves. We find that wherever digital technology especially, really gets adopted early and gets adopted thoroughly, we find lower levels of social trust and lower levels of happiness. And we find increasing levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. We can really see that if you look at something like Jonathan Haidt, his book, The Anxious Generation, where he looks at what's happening with Gen Z. Well, we find a real increase in anxiety and depression beginning in 2012. Why is that? It's the first year that a majority of middle school kids had their own smartphones and their own social media accounts. And every year since then, we find rising stress, anxiety, and depression. So there's a real close tie between digital technology, especially, and well-being. But I'll also say this: I think it goes back farther. It's not just the digital technology that's the most powerful and most recent kind that we've had experience of in our lives. But if we look back at the history of friendship within our nation, we find evidence that social ties have been declining for probably about 200 years. As soon as we become industrialized, we become less dependent on our neighbors for survival and for well-being. And so we've had a real gradual decline in friendship and an increase in individualism in this nation for about 200 years now.
Well, when I was in graduate school, I have a graduate degree in sociology, and back then we read this book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, and we'll get to that again later in this conversation. But I wanted to read a quote from it because it ties into what we're talking about here with increased use of technology and social media, and it's kind of ironic because he says, as the 21st century opens, we are only a few years into the era of widespread access to the internet. Yet it is hard to avoid speculating that the implications of this new technology of communication may dwarf the effects of the telephone on American society. He wrote that in 2000 when this book came out. The iPhone came out in 2007, and it's very ironic that he predicted this exactly. And then I think about too, I kind of want your thoughts on the home-based or phone-based culture where we have the inner circle of friends, so that makes us closer to them, and then the middle circle, and then the outer circle, of course, is the people that we meet on the online, or that's an online circle, and that makes that stronger too. But what happens to that middle circle of those social connections that aren't part of our inner circle?
Yeah, so that outer circle, or kind of medium circle there of acquaintances, people that we interact with now and then within our communities, are incredibly important for, they become largely the basis for the people that eventually move into the inner circle. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge correlation between the number of acquaintances one has at 20 years old is highly correlated to the number of close friends you have when you're 60. And that's just because of the amount of time you have to spend with people. So and what we're finding is people in their 20s right now are not spending nearly as much time in the kind of social interactions to expand that, what you're calling that medium circle, right? And so they're probably not going to have as many close friendships when they're older. And that is too bad. That's one of my main points of emphasis now, as I've been going around and talking, is telling mainly young people, you need to do something about this now. You can't wait till you get older to say, I don't have enough friends, and you need to start investing in your friendships early on in your teens and in your 20s, because it takes a long time, and you've got to develop both the social skill and the network to draw from to develop these friendships. We can work on it at any time in life, but it's just like investing. You're much better off if you're going to invest money. start investing when you're in high school and when you're in college. Don't wait until you're in your 40s, or you're just not going to, the compound interest just isn't going to be there. It's the same with friendship.
Well, and what you said too kind of ties into my next question. With young people in particular are spending more time communicating and building friendships online, virtually. And so how does that correlate with the decrease in empathy and moral formation that we're seeing now?
So there's a couple things. I I don't think that forming friendships online is necessarily a bad thing. And I've met plenty of young people who formed like very good friends online, but it's usually when they're participating in just heavily in one or two small communities that are focused on similar interests. So like a small group of artists or a small group of gaming enthusiasts who are interacting and get to know one another really well. That sort of thing I think is pretty healthy because they're spending a lot of time. But the kind of online interaction where you are occasionally having communication, but you're mostly like clicking through videos and liking and disliking things, like that's kind of online participation doesn't help us get to know people really well. It's not conversation. And it's so a heavy time spent in that kind of that's I would say it's not even really social interaction except in a very kind of weak sense. So what we call social media, that's largely, browsing through videos, is not social interaction. And when we find young people spending a lot of time, the average 13-year-old, I think, spends somewhere around 14 hours a day right now on digital media. And it's mostly that kind of unproductive. You have somebody who is, say, 12, 13, 14, spending that much time doing that. What they are not doing is spending time developing the capacity for reading facial expressions, learning tone of voice, all these things that go into empathy, like for kind of being able to know or actually feel what somebody else is feeling. This takes a long time to develop. And so, especially at those ages, it's really important to have a regular face-to-face interaction with other people, because you're developing these skills that are developing as your brain develops. And it's not something that you can just go back and recover later on.
Right. And too, that the nature of online entertainment, if you will, is so kind of status based, right? It's kind of judgmental. So it's not necessarily a positive in that regard, in terms of their own, even their own identity, formation of their own identity.
Yeah, well, it's all based on algorithms that are designed to get more kind of continual engagement, right? And that means it rewards extremes. And so you get the emotional extremes of the people loving something or hating something. And this is not a good basis for emotional stability, especially like when you're in middle school. You already have a lot of emotional volatility. And what happens if you have a small group of good friends, what they do is they help modulate your emotional state. So when something really great happens, they kind of bring you back to earth. When something terrible happens, they lift you up. And so they help you kind of modulate, and this is really healthy. This is what a group of close friends does. What online does, just because of the algorithm it's designed to this, is amplify whatever the emotions we're feeling. So if we're feeling great, it amplifies that. If we're feeling terrible, it amplifies it.
Yeah.
And it puts us in a constant state of uncertainty. And there's a lot of stress that goes with social uncertainty. And this is biological. This just goes back to, like, our brains are pretty much the same brains that our ancestors had, where like it's really important to be part of a group that's going to protect you and watch your back. And if you're isolated and alone, you're under stress because you're in danger. I was talking to a parent of a 13-year-old girl whose school just banned cell phones first time, like they banned them from bell to bell. And she came home like the second or third day. Her mother asked, like, how was school? And she says, I am so relieved there's no cell phones. I don't have to worry about tripping in the hallway and having somebody video me. And her mother was kind of shocked at that. Like, why would you be worried about that? But we don't have a really good idea of what kids that age are thinking about, what they're preoccupied with, and things like potentials for social embarrassment. These are huge. And so this particular girl was living with this kind of stress every day in school before that. And this is kind of what social media does, is it creates this atmosphere of real uncertainty about where you stand in relation to others. That's completely contrary to what happens when you have a healthy group of friends who kind of help you feel that you're stable. Your social identity is fairly stable because people have your back.
I did fail to mention at the beginning of the show, and I apologize. This is an interactive program, and so if you have a question, go ahead, raise your hand, put it in the chat. There is a question in the chat from Dell. He wants to know. This is an excellent question, and one I had as well. Is our middle class disappearing?
I don't know if it's disappearing, but it is shrinking. Yeah, it's not shrinking at the same rate everywhere in the country. So, and that's kind of interesting. But when we look at something, I know you're going to refer later to the Social Capital Atlas, where and that kind of shows you where you have real healthy kind of economic diversity and where you have economic connectedness. So where people at lower income levels will know people at higher income levels. And that's really important in a society, that people at different income levels get to know one another. You tend to have good economic connectedness where you have a lot of people economically in the middle. And so places where that middle is shrinking, you have less economic connectedness, which means less social connectedness.
Interesting. So I'm gonna shift a little bit. Because over the years, I brought up the book Bowling Alone, and you already told us what social capital is, the bonding capital, the bridging capital, and the significance of that. And over the years, the fields of sociology and social psychology have taken a particular interest in how changes in our personal lives affect the society as a whole. So in Bowling Alone, well, first of all, who is Ray Oldenburg, and what does he mean by third places?
So Ray Oldenburg was a sociologist in Florida. He just passed away a couple of years ago. He wrote a book in 1989 called Celebrating the Great Good Place. And in that book, he said, you can imagine that your first place is your home, second place is where you work, third place is where you go to socialize. And he was speculating in 1989 that third places in the US are disappearing. And with that disappearance comes a loss of social connection. So then Robert Putnam comes out with Bowling Alone, measuring social capital and looking at the decline of social capital or social trust from 1950 to 2000. And people quickly were tying together this loss of social capital with the decline of third places that Ray Oldenburg had been talking about in the 80s and 90s.
Well, and I think it was either in a presentation I saw that you did, or in the book where you talked about, as an example, you visited a bowling alley outside of Texas. And what did they tell you about bowling leagues as an example?
Yeah, so that was in my book. This was my son at the time was in a youth bowling league. And I got to know the owner of the bowling alley here in La Crosse, Wisconsin, where I live, pretty well, because we would be there all the time with our son in the league. And his name was Dick, and his daughter went to college in Texas, and so he drove her down there. And driving in Texas, he came across this brand new bowling alley with something like 40 or 50 lanes. It had and so he thought, this is great to see like bowling must be really popular. So he stopped in, he talked to the manager, and he says, how many leagues do you have here? And the guy said, none. No bowling. He's people come for birthday parties, you know, and they'll bring a small group of friends, or they bowl by themselves, and people just come in and bowl. And he was really amazed by that, because here was somebody in Wisconsin operating this bowling alley, thinking really like the future of the sport is really like, how do they keep the leagues intact? And these leagues are great. They're basically clubs that people join.
Right.
Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone says that the research shows that if you don't belong to anything, then just joining one club reduces your chance of dying in the next year by 50%.
Incredible.
It has an incredible effect on our health and well-being. Joining, like getting to know a group of people really well.
Well, and it's interesting too to think about. I think back to my parents' generation, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when things have changed because of the automobile, the television, the growth of cities, and along with that, then came a decrease. Along with that, then we see a decrease in people actually participating in things that required them to depend on each other or get together to do things. So it was long before social media, but that this started. But now enter the pandemic and the rise of social media, and it's a perfect storm for you get the we can't get together, coupled with the we don't have to get together, and what's that done to our society?
Yeah, and we have a few years now to look back on what happened during the pandemic, and what it looks like is the pandemic just accelerated a lot of trends that were already happening. So the decline in social trust was accelerated during the pandemic. The increase in loneliness. So that increased greatly during the pandemic. It has recovered a bit since then, but we still have more loneliness than there was, say, in 2018 or 2019. People are spending less time with friends. We increased the technology that allows us to do things independently and separately. So a lot of stores and banks and things like that invested in the technology that allows people to do transactions without talking to people, right? So there's more of the automatic checkout counters and that sort of thing than there used to be. And so that all that technology was coming, it just that the pandemic speeded it up.
Yeah, because I think it's ironic even, like I can sit in my computer at home and have my groceries delivered to me. I mean, I don't even have to go to the store anymore. And if I do, I could just call ahead or order ahead and say, I'm just going to pick them up if you could go those together for me. So it's in our everyday lives, right? And so it's kind of a unique thing. It's something we've never seen in society before. And so when I think the quote, and correct me if I'm wrong, you had you referred to that the world seems to be getting better, but we're feeling worse about it. So why is our subjective feeling for the world's current status so much worse, while objectively conditions are actually improving?
Yeah, it is a really strange thing when you just look at this superficially. That like all this data shows that people really think the world is getting worse. They think it's getting more violent, that we have more conflict, that there's more pollution, for example. There's actually less pollution. Our air and water has never been cleaner in the past 100 years. Our life expectancy has been going up now in this country for well over 100 years, and in most continents for about 100 years or a little more. So the poverty has been reduced greatly. In 1950, about 75% of the world lived in extreme poverty, and that's on less than $1.25 a day in today's dollars. So if you were just going to choose, like if you could be born at any point in history, you'd want to choose right now. You have the best chance of not being born in poverty and living a long time. And yet we have higher rates of anxiety, burnout, stress, depression, loneliness. All these measures of subjective well-being are considerably worse today than they ever have been since we started measuring them. Most of them we've only been measuring since 1990, but the ones that we've been measuring even longer than that show that they've been declining for quite a while. So that's really odd. So objectively, we're healthier, we live longer, we have more wealth, we're more depressed, anxious, lonely.
Is that, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and
Is,
so like that's this big puzzle. So why is that happening? And I think it is because we require regular social interaction to feel good, to be happy, and to feel emotionally stable. And we know this, like when we do studies of people's mental well-being, their mental health, it's very strongly correlated with the number of friends people have. And so our friendships are declining as we become more independent. And the more wealthy and more technologically advanced we become, the more independent we become, and the fewer friends we have, and the worse we feel.
would you say that our increased independence makes us more individualistic as well? And what impact did industrialization have on that increase in individualism?
So yeah, so industrialization it brings two things: increased technology, which gives us more power and convenience, and increased wealth, which also gives us more independence from others. So as long as we've had industrialization, what we see is, like, when we look at generational character traits, what we find is each generation is more individualistic and grows up more slowly. Growing up more slowly is really interesting because we tend to think, oh, kids are growing up so fast these days. But by growing up more slowly, what sociologists mean is that, well, like all the markers of maturity, they reach at a later age. And so the first job is at a later age. The first time they're allowed to, like, be home alone without an adult is at a later age. The time of getting married, having children, all of these things are come at a later age for every generation since industrialization. Well, that makes sense. I mean, I remember my grandmother's earliest memory is when they moved to a homestead in eastern South Dakota when she was 3 years old, and her father was a rancher, and he would be gone for days at a time, and they had some milk cows and some pigs at the home, and they had a sod home. When her mother would see that, like, the cows had reached the horizon, she would have to get on a horse and ride out to round up the pigs and the cows. My grandmother's task was to watch her baby brother, who was 1 year old, and keep rattlesnakes out of the house. Now, we don't do that anymore with 3-year-olds, right?
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness, right? Yeah, that's our earliest memory. Keep the snakes out of the house so they don't get your baby brother. But like in Illinois right now, it is illegal to leave a 13-year-old alone at home. And so, like, we expect much less of kids because we're not as economically dependent on kids' contribution, to the household. And so as societies become more wealthy, we don't depend on children as much, but we also don't depend on our neighbors as much.
Sure.
Right?
There's a question in the chat, and I apologize, Laura. I think you put this in there a little while ago. She asked, are we lazy or fearful? And I think that's referring back to when we were talking about the increase in individualism and how we don't depend on each other so much anymore.
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
Laura, if that's what you were referring to. But are we more lazy or fearful than we were prior to recent history?
Yeah, I don't know about lazy. I mean, it could be, that's kind of like are we That's kind of hard to measure because
Sure.
it's also a negative judgment about people. It's not really a trait that we measure and we have objective
Right.
measurements of, but we're certainly more fearful because we can measure that. We can ask people like, how secure do you feel? How safe do you feel?
Mhm.
I mean, this is one of the reasons like children spend less time in unstructured play or spending time in play with other children without adult supervision. It's because parents are much more fearful of their children's well-being. All the data indicates children are safer than they've ever been. And yet parents are convinced that they're at more risk. Um, that's largely because like we don't know our neighbors as much. And so
Sure.
living in a neighborhood where people used to know all their neighbors, of course you'd let kids go out and play in the neighborhood because other adults are watching out for them. So so we are definitely more fearful.
And then Beth asked, and I think we touched on this a little bit. How does the gap between the wealthy and not wealthy factor in? And I think was that what you were referring to is because that broader gap exists, the middle section where we build our social connections is kind of withering.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we find like where so here's a reason why this is so important. This economic connectedness, like, and you need a strong middle because that's where the connection happens between the wealthy and the poor. If we want our country to be a country of opportunity, where people can move out of poverty and up into like better economic status, all the studies show that the best way to do that is have children live in communities with a lot of economic variety
Diversity.
because they network and they get to see other possibilities for life, like for education, and they're able to take advantage of conversations or connections they have in order to move into other kinds of life. But if children grow up in poverty and everybody they know is poor, it is very likely that they're going to remain in poverty. So in
And that's
places with low social capital and with a weak middle class, there's only about like 3 to 4% ratio of children moving out of poverty into the middle class. In places with really high levels of social capital and with a healthy middle class, it's much greater, like 20 to 30% move out of poverty into better economic conditions. So it's not a matter of doing the right programs or the right kind of like all those things are important. It's good to have good schools and good programs and all these things. But the most important thing is just like economic diversity within neighborhoods.
Would you say too, with that diversity piece, not just the economic diversity, but also the cultural diversity to decrease that othering piece where people are fearful of each other or what they don't understand?
Absolutely. And so cultural diversity, I find in some ways kind of problematic. You don't necessarily want a lot of cultural diversity like within every community.
Mhm.
Because one of the ways in which like overall we have a lot of cultural diversity is you allow places for cultural traditions and rituals to develop. Like you want places where people are all speaking the same language and sharing the same traditions and all of that, because the only way in which that gets passed on to the next generation is you have to have a lot of practice of those traditions and rituals and things. Right. And so children are growing up in a neighborhood or a community with a lot of cultural diversity. They don't grow up with any kind of strong cultural tradition that they get to pass on. So if we have diversity everywhere, we will in a couple of generations lose all our diversity.
That's
Right.
interesting. My grandparents lived in Little Italy, so I totally get what you're saying. It makes absolute sense. So how does that play into then when you have an enclave like that? And this is a little bit aside, but how does that play into um, like making those social connections outside of your your safe space, your enclave, your Little Italy?
Yeah, so I think it's possible to have those enclaves and be a member of one of those enclaves where you develop a real kind of secure sense of your identity, and also do it in a way in which you're quite open to others having a secure sense of their identity that's quite different and very interesting to you. I think it's where we don't have such a secure sense of our identity, and where we feel that it's threatened, that we become hostile to others that are different. And so, like, I find in the United States that we are almost solely focused on the importance of individual diversity and not of group diversity. But I think the only way where we really develop an acceptance of broad-based cultural diversity is where people become really comfortable with their own cultural identity.
Well, and I just realized there's a fantastic comment in the chat from Steve. I wanted to share that quick because, and then we're going to move on to third places. But Steve said, and this is so on point, so much of our lives used to require routine entry into groups, but today technology not only provides avoidance, but teaches avoidance of places of groups or groups. And I think, yeah, I think that kind of goes exactly to what your whole book talks about, a lot of those things. So I want to talk about, I just realized we're running short on time. So third places. We've talked about that's the place where you go to form your social connections, your friendships. What are, really briefly, some of the characteristics of third places?
So third places, so they're places that are really conducive to conversation. So they're both comfortable. They provide a variety of places within the place. There's opportunities for engagement, and there's usually some places where you can be fairly intimate in very small groups or some larger groups. They're accessible, so they're easy to get to, so that they're open and available when you have the leisure time, like after work or before work or on weekends, that sort of thing.
Sure.
They're affordable, so that you can have many people in your community participate in them. And they're really they will usually be defined by the presence of regulars, people who are there on a regular basis, who give the place its character. I also find something I didn't talk about too much in my book, but which I find increasingly important. There are hosts who make sure that everybody's welcome. And it's really important for a flourishing third place, for whoever is running or managing that place to be somebody who is quite welcoming and who looks out for the comfort and the convenience of the people who come in as guests.
I think when I was reading the primary characteristics of third places, and I know Cheers came out in 1982, and that was what I immediately. I think almost all of us are familiar with Cheers, where you want to go where everybody knows your name. And Oldenburg wrote his thing about third places in 1989. So I wondered if some of that launched off of kind of what he saw in Cheers. But what are some of the challenges of creating third places, and why is it difficult for young adults in particular, to identify their third places?
Yeah, so those are two very different questions, but in a way they're kind of related. So one of the things that happened is after World War II, zoning laws changed in most communities that didn't allow commercial establishments within residential neighborhoods. So if you go to very old cities, you find corner taverns and cafes and coffee shops within neighborhoods. And in most Midwestern places where most of the development took place after the war, you don't find that at all. And so you have the commercial places, which are most of people's third places are privately owned, privately run places, coffee shops, cafes, taverns, that sort of thing. And those are in places that you have to drive to. That makes it less convenient and less accessible. So that's some of the challenge. The other is that, as soon as you get a successful business, say coffee shop, for example, this is a big challenge of many coffee shops, is that, so how are you going to make this place affordable? Because now you've got to pay wages, you've got to pay for coffee prices are increasing, you've got to pay for, the physical upkeep of the place. And how you do that is you get more churn. You keep customers coming through the door and serving more coffee. But a third place is where people come and they spend time together in conversation, and you don't necessarily make money off the conversation. And so this becomes a challenge as businesses become more expensive to run. You make more money by getting people in and out the door quickly, but the third places are places where people can come and spend some time.
I wish we had more time because as you know, Dr. Kyte, I had a lot more questions for you. But I want to touch on really quick the Social Capital Atlas, because this is something that it's actually really fascinating. I'm going to put a link to it in the chat. And basically, can you tell us what it is and kind of what it tells us?
So yeah, the Social Capital Atlas is something started by a researcher named Raj Chetty, who started looking at ways of measuring various kinds of social and economic interaction all over the country. And so in the Social Capital Atlas, you can look up your community based either on zip code or county, and you can do a quick search, and you can look up things like what is the economic connectedness within your community? How well do people of different economic levels, how many people do they know within the same level or within different economic levels, but also social connectedness. And then what I find really fascinating, friending bias. How hard or easy is it to make friends in your community? And so I find this just fascinating to look. And when I go to different places in the country, it's one of the first things I do as I look up based on the zip code, what is the economic connectedness and the friending bias and volunteering rates within that community?
Well, and I shared this with Dr. Kyte before we went live, and I, of course, went on and I looked at South Dakota, which is extremely interesting. If you could go in and put in your own county, but look at this is the civic engagement piece. So this is the volunteering piece. This is cohesiveness, and it's pretty unique for South Dakota. And then the last one I want to show you really quick is economic connectedness. So you see that South Dakota is pretty diverse across the spectrum there. And I encourage you to go in and take a look at what your community, what your county looks like, because there's information in there for all of us. And so, you know, as Dr. Kyte and I spoke before we went live as well, we're the ones that are going to have to fix the social, you know, the social disconnect that we have right now. We need to create those third places because nobody's going to create them for us. And we are running out of time. So I wanted to share one quote from page 121 of your book, Dr. Kyte. You said, "To address the symptoms stemming from the loss of social connections, we need to spend more time in the company of others. But instead, we keep turning to so-called solutions that promise to cure us, but actually make us feel worse. Apps on our phone for decreasing stress, fenced yards to help us feel safe, social media to relieve our boredom and isolation. When these things do not work, we become distrustful of one another and cynical about the very institutions that have historically fostered social connections. We look about for someone or something to blame." And I think that kind of puts it, I mean, that hits the nail right on the head. We are the ones that have to make these changes possible and create these third places. So for those who read your book and visit the Social Capital Atlas, the link in the chat, and listen to your podcast, which, by the way, I'm pretty devoted to. It's a weekly podcast. I put the link in the chat. You'll learn something new every week. What is one thing you hope that people will take away from your book and today's discussion?
If you don't have a third place, find one or make one. I've been talking to people all over the country since the book came out a little over a year ago. I talked to all these people who are lonely looking for a third place, and they want to know how to find one, not realizing there's a whole bunch of other people just like them in their community. And if you can say invite a few people to join you for coffee once a week, you will find people are eager, waiting for invitations like that. And as simple as say, let's spend an hour together every Wednesday morning for coffee. You will find people that just are hungry to do that, to just talk to other people, get to know them. And I would say that's one thing. Invest in relationships and make it a priority in your life.
What would you say is a way to seek out those like-minded individuals that we're talking about, those people that you want to get together with?
You just have to spend enough time with some people to find out if you're like-minded enough to get along. In my coffee group, there's a guy who started coming about 6 years ago that I couldn't stand for 2 years. I put up with him long enough. Now we are pretty good friends. And so don't be too quick to just say you need to find people that you get along with. You can end up getting along with just about everybody. There's some people you have to draw the line. But I think it really makes your life more interesting when you spend time with people that you don't necessarily get along with right away.
Yeah.
And you learn how to get along with them. I think that makes life just more interesting and rich.
There's one more question from Tara in the chat, and this is a good question. What happens when your second place is also your third place? I could relate to that, Tara.
And this is much more common for people. We're spending more time, many people are spending more time at work than ever, and then work becomes the main source of our friendships. And so second place, and then for many people, their first place is where they're working also, because they're working from home, either part of their job or sometimes all of it. I would say that there's nothing wrong with like good friendships at work, and for having like really healthy socialization in your workplace. And I think it's something that all workplaces should encourage, but you should also really, really seek to go outside of that somewhere in your community where you're interacting with people. This is most easily done by joining some kind of club or some kind of group. So whether it's a service organization, a church, or a hobby group or a book club, any kind of group where you're making a commitment to others to show up on a regular basis, and then others are depending on you. That's what you're really looking for. So what I advise all the time, just join something. That doesn't mean you're making a lifetime commitment, but join and make a commitment to show up for a period of time and see what happens. It almost always makes your life better.
Well, we are out of time. So I want to thank you, Dr. Kyte, so much for, first of all, writing this book, because it's amazing. I've read it twice now, and both times I've found something new that I can work with. And I think about too, when you said, joining a book club, you can create a book club. If you don't have one, make one. Like I said, we are out of time. So I do want to thank everybody else for joining us as well. I hope you got some valuable information and insights out of this discussion today, that you'll find your third place or create a third place and invite others to join you. And I hope that you'll join us again in a couple of weeks. We are going to start celebrating Native American Heritage Month, the month of November. And we're going to start it off by having 3 incredible women join us to discuss the importance of Lakota language preservation and the programs that they're creating in the organizations and institutions in which they work, and the importance of making that available to young people and adults to keep that language alive. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Kyte, for being here today, and enjoy your weekend, everybody. I hope we'll see you in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you.